People on Cape Cod, I think, accuse me of being part of this Sicilian syndicate. Can you hear me okay back there? Well, thank you very much for inviting me tonight to speak to you a bit about renewable energy and some of the challenges and opportunities in it. And I hope that some of the things that you hear tonight will inspire, especially the students in the classroom, will inspire the students to think about, getting involved in this industry, because we're going to need a lot of renewable energy to solve some of these challenges that we're facing. And we need a lot of creativity and a lot of energy entering into this industry. Now, I started back in 1974. What inspired me to get into the energy industry was I was sitting in a 2-block gas line on I think it was an odd day. You could only get gas on odd or even days, depending upon your license plate. This happened after the oil embargo that occurred back in the early 70s. And I started to think about the impacts that had on New England. We were very heavily dependent on oil. A lot of the factories that powered the economy here in New England were oil generated. And I could see a lot of the dislocation, the economic dislocation and the social dislocation of an event like that. And I just started to think about energy and decided that I was going to go into the energy conservation business. Energy prices were high, factories were struggling, institutions were struggling. So we wanted to go in and see if we could help these facilities reduce their fuel costs. And we spent about the first 10 years of the company's existence going into colleges and factories, hospitals, and working with them to significantly reduce their fuel consumption and pollutant emissions. And as we did that work for about 10 years, I started to think about, is there a way to really make a bigger mark in conservation? I mean, I was going into some facilities that used 200,000 gallons annually. Maybe the largest facilities would use 1 million gallons or use maybe 50,000 MCF of natural gas annually to power their operations. And we started to think about, well, who are the biggest energy consumers in New England? And it turns out that they were the electric generation facilities. Those were the biggest users of fuel. I mean, some of these facilities could use 1 million gallons in a week. So we started to look at the portfolio of energy resources in New England. And this was, at a time when the electric utilities were the last monopoly in the United States. Natural gas had been deregulated, trucking, airlines, the telephone industry had become deregulated, and now this was the very early beginnings of the deregulation of the electric utilities, which was really fomented by Jimmy Carter when he passed the Public Utility Regulations and Policy Act, which for the first time would allow people from outside the industry, not vertically integrated utilities, but people from outside the industry would have an opportunity to develop an electric generation facility. So when we looked at the portfolio back this was now in the 1980s, we saw that New England was heavily dependent on coal, heavy oil, and nuclear power. There was a bit of hydro, electricity, but it was really heavy oil and coal and nuclear. And we had the idea of looking at trying to generate electricity with natural gas-fired combined cycle generation facilities. These were where you took a gas turbine, and gas turbines power jet planes. There are aeroderivative gas turbines and there are stationary gas turbines. We looked at taking gas turbine, coupling it with a heat recovery boiler. You'd basically capture the waste heat from generating electricity, and you take that waste heat and put it through a steam turbine, and that's why they were called combined cycle plants, where you'd combine a gas turbine and a steam turbine, and you could effectively generate power much more efficiently than some of the coal and heavy oil plants. In fact, some of the coal plants had heat rates of 13,000 MMBTU per kilowatt, or the oil plants maybe had 11,000 MMBTU per kilowatt. We were now, with these combined cycle plants, able to generate, and I'm going back over 25 years, where the heat rates there were about, for gas turbines, you could generate a kilowatt with maybe 9,000 MMBTUs. So when you look at now generating a kilowatt of electricity with 9,000 MMBTUs instead of 13,000, and it turns out that the way you generate the electricity is also more efficient. It produces orders of magnitude less pollutant emissions. We thought we were really onto a pretty good idea. And basically what we tried to do is we tried to find a way to do cogeneration projects where you'd not only generate the electricity, but you'd extract some steam from the steam turbine, and you could power a food shortening facility. You could power a paper mill. And some of the first projects we did in New England were cogeneration facilities. And it turned out that from about 1985 to 1999, we built 7 natural gas-fired combined cycle plants and a biomass electric generation facility as well. And these produce great efficiencies over the older plants. What we were most proud of is in a number of those occasions when we were developing these natural gas-fired plants, for instance, there was a competing developer that was trying to develop a 300 megawatt coal plant in New Bedford. We came up with a better solution and presented a natural gas-fired plant, and actually we were able to win that slot and prevent a coal plant from being built in New Bedford. When a developer was trying to develop a coal plant in East Providence, we had a better idea. We thought we could develop a natural gas-fired plant in Pawtucket, Rhode Island, and we did. And the coal plant in East Providence failed. Same thing happened in Taunton, Massachusetts, where a developer was developing the Silver City coal plant. We came up with an idea to put a natural gas-fired plant in Dayton, Massachusetts, which won out over the coal plant. So, we were able to, we were actually able to displace not only existing operations of more efficient plants, because we were more efficient, we would get dispatched on, but we were also able to prevent some coal plants being produced. Now, in about 1999, we took a step back and we looked at the electric portfolio in New England. And it had made, natural gas had made incredible penetration in the portfolio. We were now back in 1999 looking at almost probably 40%, going from literally zero natural gas-fired electric generation back in the early 80s, looking at 1999, 2000, now we were generating almost 40% of our electricity with natural gas. So we took a step back and said, you know, we don't want to, you know, just as we tried to diversify the portfolio with natural gas, maybe it's time to start looking at ways to further diversify New England's energy portfolio. And we started to look at a range of renewable energy technologies. And we, you know, so many people have always said that New England is at the end of the energy pipeline, that we have no indigenous energy resources. But that proves to be a false statement, because we have very substantial wind resources. We have wind resources on land. A lot of it is in the, you know, in Maine and New Hampshire and Vermont and out in Western Mass. But it turns out that we have an enormous offshore wind resource. So what we did is we wanted to develop a utility scale wind power project, something that would really move the needle and not only produce significant quantities of electricity, but that would also displace a lot of CO2 emissions, nitrogen oxides and sulfur dioxide, something that would really also be a pioneering effort to get people to think about this offshore wind resource that we have. And we came up with the idea of Cape Wind after looking all throughout New England. We looked in the mountains of northern New Hampshire, we looked in Maine, we looked in Vermont. You know, there's wind up there, but the transmission lines were heavily loaded, and the electric demand in those areas was not increasing as rapidly anywhere near the growth in southern New England. That's where the population growth was, that's where electric demand was increasing. So we started to look in southern New England, and frankly, you know, in Massachusetts, we just don't have large tracts of available land. I mean, you know, but we have this huge resource offshore. So we decided that we were going to develop America's first offshore wind farm. And we were going to Europe every other month. We went to Denmark, we went to Sweden, and we saw the first offshore wind farms that were developed back in 1991. Offshore wind farms have actually been operating in Europe. They were smaller demonstration projects, but since 1991, and today in the United States, today there are 55 operating offshore wind farms in Europe. 55 operating wind farms. There are many, many more planned. There are thousands of megawatts planned. There are multi-billion dollars of investment going into Europe's offshore wind industry. It's creating thousands of jobs. The peak production from offshore wind in the North Sea will actually exceed the peak production of oil generated in the North Sea in the UK. So it's really starting to take off in Europe. And you know, we started to think, well, would windmills, wind turbines be a good cultural fit for Cape Cod? And you know, we just looked back in history and we noted that During the Revolutionary War, when General Washington's army, when the British blockaded salt, which was desperately needed by General Washington's army, he needed it for the horses, he needed it for medicine, he needed it to salt the cod, and the British blockaded it. Well, the Continental Congress put out a clarion call to the colonists. They said that we are going to pay you an extra penny a bushel if we start producing salt here. And soon there were windmills all up and down Cape Cod. Because, why? Because Nantucket Sound, the salty sea, and the enormous wind resource there. And we were developing our own salt. People from Cape Cod helped General Washington and aided, our effort to win the Revolutionary War. And at the same time, I see that Congress is putting out a 2.2 cent production tax credit. There's a clarion call from Congress to develop more renewable energy. And it was bipartisan. And the call was being led by our senators, Senator Kennedy, tremendous renewable advocate, Senator Kerry, from the area, complaining to the Bush administration that there isn't enough renewable energy going on. So, we thought, this is great. We thought back then, we knew that we need ports, and, New Bedford, there was a port in New Bedford, there was a port in Fall River, and at one time, Massachusetts was the energy capital of the world. Herman Melville, Moby Dick, New Bedford, we lit the lamps of the world. We lubricated the industrial machinery around the world with whale oil. New Bedford was one of the most prosperous cities in the United States. The New Bedford banks financed the Transcontinental Railroad. There were people from Cape Cod and New Bedford and Martha's Vineyard and Nantucket that ended up advancing the technology of whaling and coming up with new ship techniques. And soon we were managing fleets as far as the Pacific. So we said, this is terrific. We're gonna bring this all back. Everybody's gonna be happy. We're gonna be paraded down Main Street as heroes. I guess sometimes history doesn't repeat itself. But before the ink was dry on the proposal, there was a entrenched elite group of Cape Codders that felt threatened, that this would maybe change the quality of their life, that the Cape would turn into a ghost town, people would abandon it, there'd be no tourists, the wind farm would be a killing field for birds, whales that have never been in Nantucket Sound would all of a sudden come and bump into the turbines. At one hearing, and Greg Watson was the head of the Mass Technology Collaborative. He was running stakeholder meetings on the Cape hearings to try to elicit people's concerns and have experts come in and explain a bit about offshore wind and bring in people from Denmark. At one meeting, we had one of the foremost experts on climate change, David Aubrey from the Woods Hole Research Institute. And he was talking about how the beaches on Cape Cod were already being feeling the impacts of climate change, and he was talking about more frequent and intense storms coming. And one woman in the audience raised her hand and said, you know what? We don't have to worry about climate change, because when these guys go out and they bang these 130 wind turbines into Nantucket Sound, it's going to make the ocean rise and it's going to wipe us out anyway. So, I mean, these were some very interesting times, but, you know, I mean, we spent a lot of time going into senior citizens' homes, elementary schools, high schools, Lions clubs, Rotary clubs. We did forums, and we kind of tried to explain what this project was. And one of the things we said at our first public hearing is we said, look, we think this may be a good idea, and we think it has potential. But we won't know until we go through this regulatory process. And by God, this is going to be at least a 2 or 3 year regulatory process. And there's going to be 17 federal and state agencies looking at every aspect of this project. Well, what happened was that this process took a lot of time. And the opposition group was, you know, hiring public relations people, lobbyists. They were spending, one afternoon they raised $4 million at a yacht club. In one afternoon, had pledges of $4 million to salt the bank account of the opposition group. And we were kind of out there, and we went to the environmental organizations, and they said, they said, you know, Jim, this sounds like a good idea. It really looks like it has promise, but we're not going to make a knee-jerk reaction like the opposition group, because we're science-based, and we have to make our decisions based on, you know, our marine biologists, our ornithologists, looking at this and examining. So we need to see some of the results of at least the draft environmental impact statement. So the environmental groups were very encouraging and very supportive of us, because, you know, they knew our company. We had worked with them before in the effort to get these cleaner natural gas-fired plants in and you know, try to displace the coal and oil. And when the environmental reports came out, all of a sudden you had organizations like Conservation Law Foundation, Greenpeace, Massachusetts Audubon Society, Sierra Club, Union of Concerned Scientists. They started to come on and actively support the project and counteract the fear-mongering and some of the red herrings that the opposition group was throwing out about the project. So that process ended up taking 10 years to permit. The Deepwater Horizon well, the environmental impact statement, it wasn't an environmental impact statement, it was an environmental assessment. That report, to get that approved, was 17 pages, and it took about 60 days. Cape Wind, which produces 0 pollutant emissions, 0 greenhouse gas emissions, consumes 0 water, and discharges 0 waste, generated hundreds of thousands of pages of exhibits, testimonies, written comment letters, socioeconomic reports. I remember one day we had as part of the process, we had a barge. We had to hire a barge and keep it out on the Nantucket Sound for 24 hours, 24/7 for like 2 months. And we had all the sophisticated radar on board. And we were doing this to look at the migratory pattern of sea ducks. Okay? And I went out there one afternoon, and I go out on the barge, and I see the ornithologists there, and the computers, and the radar, very sophisticated radar on board. And it's probably about 3 o'clock, and I hear these cracks, these loud, like booms, cracks, and I go, oh man, there's a thunderstorm coming in. So one of the crew members on the board, on the boat, said, oh, that's not lightning or thunder, those are hunters. We can kill 10,000 sea ducks a year. We have take permits to kill 10,000 sea ducks a year. So they were out hunting sea ducks while we were studying the migratory path of them. And these are all important things. I am not minimizing how important this is, because I think, although it was a very painful process, we are fully permitted. We've signed the first offshore wind lease with Secretary Ken Salazar, the head of the Department of Interior, in the U.S. history. And we also probably had over 12 lawsuits filed by the opposition group. So we've pretty much litigated a lot of the issues during the permitting process. There is still an appeal. The chairman of the opposition group, who is a noted environmentalist and the largest exporter of petroleum coke and owns one of the largest privately held coal plants in the United States, his group is appealing the NEPA, the National Environmental Policy Act review. But the good news is that it's in federal court. It's the last appeal that we have. And the NEPA standards are not whether Secretary Salazar made the right decision, yes or no. It's really whether or not the federal government took a hard look at the project. And I would say to most rational observers, after 10 years and 17 federal and state agencies and hundreds of thousands of pages of exhibits and probably the most avian research done on any energy project in the world, I would submit that they've taken a hard look at it, and the banks that are now lining up to finance the project, they've obviously hired, which we've had to hire for them. They have lawyers that have looked at this, and they believe that it's meritless and frivolous, and so we're hoping that this year we're going to be able to commence construction on the Cape Wind project. And this is, as Lou said, offshore wind holds incredible promise for the United States, and not only in increasing energy security and independence, in improving our health and environment, but also contributing significantly to mitigating climate change. The Natural Resource Defense Council said that Cape Wind is the largest single greenhouse gas reduction initiative in the United States. Now, they made that statement about 4 years ago. I don't know if it's still true today, but we will offset over 800,000 tons of CO2 annually. And the shame of it is that had we started 5 years ago, we would have had, 4 million tons of greenhouse gases that wouldn't have come into our atmosphere. So the other thing about how many minutes do I have? 2 minutes. The other thing about offshore wind, which is very important to think about, and especially now with what you're hearing about in the press about New England's concern about pipeline constraints and our over-reliance on natural gas. Unlike land-based wind farms, which produce most of their power at night, which is off-peak, offshore wind produces its electricity coincident with the peak demand. So on the hottest days of the year, because the land on Cape Cod heats up, that temperature differential sucks the wind right through Nantucket Sound. So we have a data tower, a solar-powered scientific data tower that's measured the wind speeds for years out in Nantucket Sound. We've correlated Cape Wind's production with the peak historic days in Nepal. So we'll not only produce at a lot of power on the hottest days, but on the coldest days, that's when we really are flat out. It's our highest production. So that will help allow natural gas to be diverted away from the natural gas generators. This gas will be more available for schools and hospitals. And what it does, and my vision for Nepal going ahead, because by 2020 there's 8,300 megawatts of coal and older oil plants that will probably be retired. We'll need about 6,000 new megawatts because we'll be able to do some transmission things that will cut it down to that. I really see that offshore wind and dual-fueled state-of-the-art natural gas-fired plants will help solve the pipeline constraint problem. It will prevent ratepayers from being saddled with billions of dollars of new pipeline demand charges if these pipes are being built. It will prevent us from making investments that's going to pull gas from Appalachia and Medicine Hat, Alberta. We'll be able to be self-sufficient. We'll be able to start using our own energy, and maybe we can go back to these days of prosperity when New England actually produced its own energy and was a lot better off for it. Thank you.